What's going on, everyone? I hope everything's going well out there in English 108 land. As you know, we're butting up against the midterms and we're right before spring break, and that's really good. You guys should be really proud of yourself for the work that you've done so far in the class. I've been really impressed with the quality and the consistency and the timeliness of all your work. So that's really exceptional, and I'm really happy with the way the course is going. So today's mini lecture is about developing really useful instructions. So as I talked about in my previous mini lecture, it's really no achievement to get somebody from point A to point B. What we want to do is get them from point A to point B in the most optimal, the most efficient, the safest, the most time-effective way possible. So we have to set the bar a little bit higher for ourselves. And so the way that I'm going to talk about this is through 3 essential moves that all instructions do or have. And I really truly believe that if you think carefully about these 3 moves and the things that comprise them, you're going to be in a really good position to write a user-friendly and really intuitive and useful set of instructions that nearly anybody could follow. And that's really our goal here. Just to give you a quick overview, I'm going to ask you, and I'll be posting this here within the hour, I'm going to ask you to write a set of instructions in this class. It could be about any procedure, but there's a couple of stipulations. One, it has to be a relatively complex procedure, so it has to be something that requires some level of skill, something relatively college level. Things that don't fly with me are things like how to make a really simple recipe. That's really not complex enough. Or how to make a paper airplane. This is a 100 level college class, so it needs to be something of some level of sophistication. So if you have any reservations about the topic that you're choosing or the process that you're going to write about, just let me know and run it by me. It's better to be safe than sorry. And the other stipulation is that it has to be something that somebody else can do, so that you can provide the materials and the resources and the instructions, and you can actually watch them follow your instructions, because what we're going to end up doing is conducting a usability test. And what that essentially means is that they're going to be in sort of like a little fishbowl. You're going to watch them actually do the process. You're going to see the looks of consternation on their face. You're going to see them about to do something wrong. You're going to see them do something out of order because you told them to. And it's going to be your chance to intervene and say, whoa, hold on, I need to improve the instructions here. I need to improve the way that I'm coaching you through this process. And so it's really important that it's something that somebody else can do safely. Okay, so it can't be anything that's too dangerous, but it has to be something that you feel comfortable overseeing and observing and watching somebody do. Okay, so that may impact your decision as far as what you choose, and this will all be outlined in the assignment sheet I'll post in a little bit. Okay, so I want to talk to you about the 3 essential moves. I'm going to fly through them relatively quickly because I don't want to keep you here all day. But they're really important, and the handout that I've provided for you really outlines these as well. And I'll be posting some student examples of instructions that were written in this class so that you can get a sense for what they look like. And we'll also be looking at a set of professionally written instructions that really need some work. Okay, so staging is the first thing that all good instructions do. And you might be able to tell from the term itself what it means. It really means to set the stage for success for the reader. So it means getting the right person in the right place with the right stuff. Okay, so early in a really good instructional document, it really does set the stage for the reader, and it includes all the preliminary information somebody would need to know before they begin the process. There is nothing more frustrating than beginning a process only to find out halfway through that you're not prepared in some way. So I really want you to think, and I'm going to give you a preliminary list, and there's a preliminary list listed on the handout that's posted on Blackboard. I'm going to give you some things to think about, things that generally are included, but you may find other things that you think are essential for your reader to know before they begin a process. Some of the obvious stuff are materials and tools, okay, or equipment, required materials, required tools. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. It's usually a really good idea to know before you begin something what you need to have on hand to perform that task. Let me provide a little bit of nuance to that. Not only should you provide the materials and the tools and the equipment, you should provide them in the most specific way possible. Okay, it's really important that if a reader had to make decisions about what wrench to grab out of their toolbox, or what type of flour to get to make this type of bread, that they know exactly what they need. And so you need to provide very specific information. Imagine a person who's making a bread recipe for the first time, and they walk into Hannaford and they walk into the flour aisle. They're going to be overwhelmed by all the various types of flour. And chances are, because of your wisdom and knowledge in this subject area, you probably know which one is going to work the best. So I want you to be as specific as possible when you are talking about materials, tools, and equipment. Now, sometimes that means that we're recommending specific brands. It means we're recommending specific sizes, specific types. Okay, so be very cautious of that and try to be as specific as possible because you likely know what the best tool is, what the best material is, and what the best equipment is. And so you need to impart that upon the reader because if they show up with the wrong thing, it may make the task less safe, it may make it less time efficient, they may put undue stress on the equipment, etc. So make sure that you're being hyper-specific when you're listing those things. The other thing is to make sure that you're including quantities. So if you're telling somebody that they need, staples, how many staples do they need? What size staples do they need? What type of metal do the staples need to be made out of, etc. Okay, that's really important because again, if we zoom out and we take this out of the context of class and we think about this in a trade or an industrial or a work or commercial environment, some of these decisions are really important. Okay, and they have really steep consequences in terms of money and safety and etc. So that's the first most important thing. There are other considerations that you want to make also. It's probably a good idea for your reader before they begin. If we really want to set the stage for success, they should probably know exactly what they're getting into. What exactly do these instructions guide them through? Okay, so they need to be very specific about what they include and what they do not include. And that's really important for a reader to know. If you think about a workspace that has a number of standard operating procedures, you may have a file cabinet full of them, and they may apply to different models, different situations, different makes, different times of year, and it's just really important for readers to know that they have the right set of instructions in front of them. So that's really good. It's often a good idea to give them an indicator of what the finished product will look like so that they know before they get into the process. So that's something else you want to keep in mind. You'll also want to keep in mind any persistent safety hazards. So if you're going to be confronted with a particular hazard throughout the process, that's a good thing to know. Included in tools, equipment, and material are obviously personal protective equipment, things like goggles, gloves, masks, respirators, helmets, those types of things. If those things are required or suggested, then you need to include those early on so that the person can gather those materials and be in a good space to accomplish the task. The other thing to consider is environment. So sometimes that's really important. We need to have an optimal task environment. I can tell you as a fly tyer, one of the things that is not usually communicated that readily or rapidly to folks who are just getting into fly tying is how important lighting is. If you don't have good lighting while you're tying flies, it really becomes a lot more frustrating. But if you, for instance, I've learned that if you have light coming from two different directions onto your workspace, it becomes a lot easier to see details and to really work efficiently and effectively. But almost no instructions, if you go on the web, almost none of them talk about that as a required material or a required thing to have on hand. So you really want to think about the task environment. Sometimes it's a certain amount of space that you need. Sometimes it's that you need to be on a flat surface. Sometimes it's that you need to have a certain amount of ventilation. Sometimes it's how high the ceiling has to be. Sometimes it has to be a level piece of ground. Whatever it is, you just want to make sure that the reader's in the optimal task environment to do whatever it is that you're asking them to do. Maybe they need to have a certain type of electricity on hand, or maybe they need to have some other resource. And so it's really important to establish that. There's nothing worse than beginning a task only to realize that you're doing it in the wrong spot. So I want you to keep that in mind. I also want you to keep in mind human resources, and I mean that in a couple of different ways. So if we're really trying to guide the reader through the process in an optimal way, sometimes they need to have an extra set of hands, right? So maybe you're teaching somebody how to put something together, and because of the awkwardness of the material, the size of the material, or just the nature of the movements, it would be really beneficial for them to have somebody else to steady something, hold something, and you need to include that because I don't know how many times I've started doing something. A classic example would be putting together a futon. And it's not, it's not the most taxing thing physically. It's not big and heavy, but it is relatively awkward and kind of bulky. And when you're, putting things together, sometimes it's nice to have another set of hands to keep things steady and level while you're trying to fasten them together. So that's one part of human resources. The other thing is sometimes to establish the skill level that's needed to accomplish the task. So I like to refer to the Haynes car instruction manuals. I don't know if any of you have ever used those, but they used to be pretty popular before the advent of YouTube, and you could go into VIP or O'Reilly Auto Parts or whatever your local parts store was, and they would have this little library of books, and they basically told you how to do most of the common repair and maintenance procedures for an individual make and model of car. Well, what was really cool was when you went to the particular procedure, say it was to replace the power steering pump, you would get to it and it would have a little gauge, and it would be 1 through 4 wrenches, I think. And one wrench basically meant, and it would give you a little description. It would say 1 wrench means that you feel comfortable changing your own oil, but not much else. And 4 wrenches was basically like you could tear this car down completely and put it back together. And so that gave you some sense of whether or not you were skilled enough to perform the task in the first place. And so that's really beneficial because sometimes tasks do require a certain level of technical proficiency, a certain level of licensure, a certain level of clearance. And it's really important for readers to know that before they begin. The other thing to keep in mind is time. I've started procedures before only to find out that I had to let something cure or harden or set. And it really put me in a bind because I was going away for the weekend or I had plans later. And so it's really important for people to know what the time frame is. How long should this reasonably take as a process? And so they should know that before they begin. So really, again, you can think as creatively and as exhaustively as you want, but those are just some of the things that you really ought to keep in mind. Because again, staging is setting the stage for success. It's putting the right person or persons in the right place with the right stuff. And that stuff, obviously includes things like time and expertise. Okay, so that's staging. So somewhere early in an instructional document, those things should be delineated in an easy to read, easy to follow way, so that you can quickly gather those materials, get to the right spot, and be prepared to have a successful time. Okay, so that's staging. Okay, so that's, we got to handle that early in an instructional document. Coaching is really the step-by-step directions that guide somebody through a process. So I want to talk to you about just the idea of coaching. I use the term coaching because I think that's a really good frame of mind and a really good metaphor or analogy to use, because if you're writing really good instructions, you're not just directing somebody to perform steps. You are imparting wisdom to them. And so I'll give you an example. I used to be a baseball coach, right? I used to coach high school and American Legion baseball. And I could direct somebody and say, go up there and hit the ball. Go up and hit that curveball or whatever, right? And that's directing, and that's not really that helpful. What I really, if I wanted to optimize that situation, I would assume the role as coach, okay? And I would give tips and tricks. I would give things to think about. I would actually demonstrate or show, and I would try to pull out all the stops so that I can impart my wisdom. I'm not just telling somebody to do something, because oftentimes that's not enough, especially if the person is relatively new to the task. Our job is to impart that wisdom and impart that knowledge so that people can overcome the barriers to success that are inherent in any process. So if you just think about yourself as a coach and you think about trying to leverage the resources that you can, then you're going to be in a pretty good spot. So there's some particular things I want you to think about when we think about coaching. First and foremost, you need to clearly number your steps. If you think about the way that a user or reader typically uses a set of instructions, they're moving back and forth between the task itself, okay, the task environment, where whatever they're assembling, putting together, working on, and the instructions themselves. You need to make it as easy as possible for the reader to get from the task environment back to the step that they're on. Okay, nobody wants to try to find where they're at in a 32-point bulleted list with size 6 font. That's not fun. It's not easy. It's frustrating. You can miss information, etc. So you really got to think about clearly numbering your steps. That's really important. The other thing related to that is that you should only have one action per step. We're really trying to break this down into its most bite-sized pieces. So you don't want to try to communicate too many steps or too many actions per step. So try to limit it to one action per step. Okay, so we're really trying to break this down. So, you may think that a task only has 5 steps, but if you actually begin thinking about it, baked into those 5 larger steps, there might be even more sub-steps or small things to do. And so I want you to keep that in mind. And that leads me to my next thing that you can do while you're coaching or assembling these instructions or individual step-by-step directions. And that's called segmenting. And that's taking a larger process, okay, and breaking it up into sub-processes and actually dividing the document according to those sub-processes. So the example I like to use, and you'll see this on the handout, is changing the oil in your car. Okay, so within that larger process, there are sub-processes like jacking and securing the car. Within that, there are a series of steps that you have to do, right? And then it might be, draining the spent oil, and that requires a certain number of steps. And then removing the old oil filter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so those could actually be headings. Those could actually be sections that break up the document. And why that's important, again, is because your reader is going to be moving from the task environment back to the document, and they need to be able to do that with relative ease. The other thing that you need to consider, and this is particularly true in the workplace, really particularly true anywhere except this class, is that oftentimes readers will consult instructions and they'll have a pretty good understanding of the majority of the process, and they don't really need to be coached through it, but they're looking for one very specific piece of information, and they don't really want to have to read through the entire set of instructions to find that piece of information. If they can scan through the document and find the section that pertains to their question, then they'll be in a good spot. For instance, you might know how to change the oil in a car pretty simply, but you just don't know with this particular model or piece of equipment. You may not know where the oil filter is located and exactly how you remove it and replace it. So you may want to go directly to that section. You don't need to know about where the drain plug is. You don't need to know about how to jack and secure it. You got that down. And so we're just trying to make a user-friendly document that somebody can easily navigate and really access the information that they care about in an easy way. Okay, other things that you can do as a coach, you can use visuals. Okay, so in the process of creating your instructions, I want you to think really carefully about how you might be able to use visual aids. So that could be diagrams, that could be photographs. There's a number of different ways that we can provide visual cues to our reader. You know, the old adage is a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, sometimes it's worth a lot more than that, especially when you're trying to describe the relative parts and pieces of something and their location, or if you're trying to describe some mechanism. Sometimes those things are actually really hard to capture in language, and so we're better off actually leveraging a different tool and applying the right tool for the problem, which might be a photograph. So think carefully about using visuals. You also want to provide indicators of success. So what I mean by that is oftentimes when we're performing a task, we need to know when it's appropriate to go on to the next step. And so what I want you to think about when you're doing that is how can I engage the reader's senses in this? So a lot of times we're looking for something. We're gonna see or observe some change. And so describe what that change will look like. When it looks like this, you can go on. And maybe you hear something. There's an audible click when that thing sets in. You may smell something. I know that's pretty common in cooking. It's going to smell like this. Or it may feel like this. It'll get this texture. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide information that really helps people understand when they're all set and when they can move on to the next step. Okay, so that's really important. Other things, you want to be really precise, so don't leave language open for interpretation. Just think carefully. Language is not always transparent. I think I've given this example before in this class, but if I haven't, it's a good one. You know, a lot of times you'll be having these interactions with a doctor, and they'll ask you a question. They'll say, "Well, how bad does it hurt?" And you'll say, "Well, moderately." Well, that's a slippery term. Or I once had a doctor ask me how much I drank, and I said, "I drink moderately." And he said, "Well, that really doesn't mean anything to me because for some people, moderately means 1 drink a month, and for some people, it means 7 drinks a day." So. What does that actually mean? So you need to make sure that if you say to, loosely tighten something, what does that actually mean? How many revolutions? Or, just try to be as specific as possible. If you say to pour something in slowly, what does that actually mean? How long should it take me to pour the entire quart in? So you're really trying to provide insight. And ultimately, while we're coaching, we're not only trying to articulate the individual steps, but we're trying to help people avoid any problems or hang-ups. So if you can think of areas where people have particular problems or issues, then it's your job to, through language, through images, to articulate how that person can overcome those challenges, because ultimately we want the person to be successful the first time through. So that's really important. So this is all to say that after you've set the stage and you have the right person in the right place with the right stuff, I want you to think really carefully about how you're going to coach that reader. How are you going to use a combination of typography, language, numbers, and images to help that reader solve that problem. And so really we need to think about how we're actually going to put these on the page. I can tell you that if you just, number 1 through 57 and you give me 57 steps that take up 2 pages and are just linear, that's probably not going to be very helpful because there are certain things that we can do, buttons we can push, and skills that we can leverage that can make this even more useful to our reader. Okay, so that's staging and coaching. The final move that we have to make is alerting. And alerting is really important, and it's particularly important in the workplace because for most workplaces, safety is the #1 priority, and alerts within instructions are our way to not only make sure that the process itself doesn't get spoiled or fouled, but it's also our way to make sure people stay safe. So there's 2 rules about alerts, okay? And alerts are the moments in the instructions when you are telling the reader, whoa, you're being confronted with a hazard, or whoa, this is a really important step and you need to pay close attention. There's 2 rules and they're pretty straightforward. Warnings or alerts need to be timely. They need to happen before the reader has any chance of messing up. Okay, the earlier the better, right? So the earlier you can identify a hazard or an issue, you need to do that. Okay, so it needs to be timely and it needs to be conspicuous. And by conspicuous, I mean it needs to stand out. When I tell you to think about a warning or an alert, I'm sure certain things come to your mind. Bigger font, red font, skull and crossbones, exclamation point, stop sign, right? We need to make sure that when somebody's looking through a document, they understand that there are potential hazards or issues here. And so we need to do it in a timely and a conspicuous way. And if we do that, then it's likely that the reader's going to see that, and they're going to understand. You're going to probably tell them, no, you're definitely going to tell them how to overcome that so that they are not that they don't fall victim to whatever the hazard is, or that they don't foul the process. So those are really the 3 essential moves, folks, and I can tell you that good instructions have all 3 of those, and the writer of those instructions deploys those in the most thoughtful way possible, okay? So as you begin to think about your procedure that you're going to write about, the process that you're going to write about, you should begin sketching these things out. You should begin thinking about, okay, how do I set the stage for success? What's the best way for me to coach the reader through this process? And finally, where are the moments when I really need to alert the reader to hazard? And so I hope that you can see that even though instructions, the process of guiding somebody through some procedure is relatively easy, in theory, it actually is much more nuanced and complex than that. And documentation and instructions are really, really important, okay, for all of the reasons that we've outlined. And so I think if you create a document that usefully deploys those 3 moves, staging, coaching, and alerting, you're going to be in a really good spot. And it's something that you can easily remember. So in 5 years, if you're at a workplace and they say, hey, I really want you to write a procedure for how to maintain this particular piece of machinery over here, you can go, okay, what did Mike tell me? He told me staging, coaching, and alerting, and that will give you a really good framework, and so that should put you in a pretty good spot. So I'll be updating Blackboard here in a minute with the actual instructions assignment sheet that outlines sort of what you have to do and how you'll be assessed, and then I'll also be posting the very small amount of work that I want you to do over spring break within the next 24 hours or so, because I do want you to have a true break. I know I'll be out of town, so I can't exactly expect you to do a tremendous amount of work if I'm not here to provide support for it. So that's what we're up against. I hope that you took the 21 minutes and 40 seconds to watch this, because there's absolutely no possible way you'll succeed on this assignment if you don't know what staging and coaching and alerting mean. So that's what we're up to, and I hope that helps. Thanks.